Hi, everybody. This is Adam Elenbaas from Nightlight Astrology. It's May 21st today. It's Tuesday. And I'm sitting down with several birth charts to do a few sample readings. And the reason I'm doing this is because, again, I've been saying this a lot lately, but I have a course coming up starting on June 9th. It's a year-long course in ancient astrology. And a lot of people that are interested in the course want to know how I read charts, because maybe you hear me talk about, the forecast, you hear me talk about the astrological weather, you like my channel, but you're like, do I want to study with this person? I'd like to see how they read charts a little bit. Well, first of all, it's always a good idea if you're thinking about that, to get a reading. However, right now I'm booked out quite a ways, so a lot of people can't get a reading prior to the class starting to kind of see if how I read charts, which is a good thing to know a little bit about before you study with someone, in my opinion. So at any rate, in this video, what I'm doing is I'm going through 3 different charts from 3 different clients who volunteered their charts anonymously. And I'm just going to show you some of the basic techniques, very, very basic, simple things that we do in traditional astrology using traditional techniques to read a chart. So hopefully that'll give you some sense. And even if you're not going to take my course, hopefully this will be interesting, get to know charts a little bit, and maybe help you brush up on your own skills as a reader. Now, suffice it to say, many of you probably already know that I practice Hellenistic astrology, which means that the techniques that I use incorporate whole sign houses. And also, I use the traditional 7 planets, the nodes of the moon, and the lot of spirit and fortune. Sometimes, like in this case, I've just put fortune in. And it's not that I don't pay attention to the outer planets, but in the first year course, I teach people specifically how to get really good at using just the 7 planets, which sometimes people think that if you use more planets, you're more accurate. To me, I love the outer planets. I use them quite regularly in my practice. But to me, and the way that I've been trained by my teachers, it's not a matter of accuracy. In other words, using more planets does not make you more accurate. And using fewer planets does not make you less accurate. And using fewer planets also doesn't necessarily make you more accurate either. A lot of the times people, when they're learning astrology, get overwhelmed because there's so many objects and so many symbols to read and synthesize. For the vast majority of the past 2,500 years plus, astrologers dealt with a far smaller field of symbols. And in doing that, I believe that they had the benefit of getting better and more accurate readings because they weren't starting with too many things at once. I tried this on for size, and for several years of my practice, did not use the outer planets at all. Now I use them again, as I used to. I think I use them a lot more intelligently, and I think I've gotten a lot better at understanding the use of the traditional 7 planets. The traditional 7 planets can say just as much as a chart that's filled with a lot of asteroids, or the use of the outer planets, or fixed stars, or anything else you want to throw in there. I don't want us to make astrological soup too quickly, because as soon as we just get a huge, mishmash of too many symbols, I think that our accuracy, our clarity, and our organization as readers goes way down. When you're first learning astrology, or when you're trying to become competent developing a practice or working with clients, that's not what you want. So in my first year program, we learn all about ancient astrology. We learn about foundational methods, theory, practice, history, philosophy. And in year 2, we then expand that into the outer planets and into other things like fixed stars, asteroids, etc. All of which become, for some people, very important. And for other people, they become optional, like add-ons to a reading that you can use or not. So I say that as a preliminary because that is an important thing to consider when studying with me in the first year program. You won't hear any hate from me about the outer planets at all. But you will hear my frustration with people thinking that you need them to be more accurate. So I'll just give you a sample in these 3 charts today for how I read using just the traditional 7 planets. But I will use, I will read the chart in that term, but I'll also talk about some of the ways in which the outer planets by transit are involved, because I do use the outer planets to illustrate certain timing methods or timing techniques even in the year 1 program. So that's just a few preliminary notes before we dive in here. Okay, so we have 3 clients today to look at, and I thank all of them in advance for being willing and vulnerable enough to share their charts. So the first client comes in, I'm going to call client J, and I'm going to read you what she wrote. This is what she said. Hi, Adam. Have been following you for a while. I'd love to be a chart model. Thank you, client J. Crossing fingers. I'm at a huge, too lengthy crossroads with ugh, everything, but specifically career and dharma. I gave up my license to practice naturopathic medicine after I had my daughter 3 years ago, and a separation, divorce, and general shakeup later. I'm in dire need of getting back to me. But who, what, when? Can I really put my trust in time, as I've been told? Thank you. Well, thank you, Jay, for being honest and vulnerable. Let's first of all see if we can just identify where the general shakeup has come from, where we might see some evidence of the general shakeup in your life. When we get, when a client comes in and wants to talk to us and says, this is what I've been dealing with, it's important to validate what a person has already dealt with by identifying the astrology of what they've been going through in recent times. So that's an incredibly important place to start. So I'm going to show you, let's try to get a sense of, how has the astrology as of late been affecting client J? And especially in the realm of love, right? Love and relationships and children, and how has all of that come into the picture? Well, one thing that we can look at that's been happening over the past several years, what if we were talking about the past, this is dating back for this individual, say 2 to 3 years, even a little bit more than that, when all of this started occurring, and then the divorce and the separation and the losing, quitting job 3 years back, having a child, everything like that. There's a few things. Let's start with a traditional astrological technique. First of all, we can look at the transits of planets, along with other things like time lords, annual perfections, things like that, and just get a sense of how different pieces of our chart have been activated. First of all, let's look at the ruler of the 5th house. That's the place of children. Children, we already know, may be a little bit difficult because we've got the south node in the 5th house. The south node of the moon in ancient astrology generally refers to decline, diminishment, decrease, and loss, but also austerity and detachment and wisdom that's gained through hardship. So we know that the area that's related to children in the birth chart, the 5th house, may bring up those kinds of events in this individual's life, just due to the presence of the south node in this place. Look, you can see very closely this individual was born just after, eclipse season. If you are looking at this full moon chart, this is a full moon chart, and the sun is just like 12, 13 degrees off the nodes. In fact, that could have been close enough that this person was literally born under an eclipse. I haven't looked, I didn't take the time to look, but that's close enough to eclipse season. So this person is born during clusters of eclipses, if not actually under an eclipse. So first of all, with the south node in the 5th house, and knowing that this person is born during eclipse season, again, if not directly under one, I didn't look, and having the south node in the 5th house, we would understand that one of the major changing points in life that would be an eclipsing event would be related to the topic of children. So that's one of the ways that ancient astrology gives us that signature in this chart. How do you know that the birth of a child is going to be a part of an extremely tumultuous period in life? Well, part of it, due to the placement of the south node of the moon, that is related to and part of creating the eclipses at the time that she was born, being in the 5th house of children, with its ruler, by the way, or host, Saturn, in the 12th house. And the 12th house, I won't go into a big story about the 12th house, but the 12th house is a place of loss or diminishment as well. It was called the joy of Saturn traditionally, and has to do with things that are taken away from us, among other things. So we do have the potential of being alone, of being isolated, of being removed, of falling on hard times in relationship to children. With the Saturn retrograde, we also think of major life reversals. Well, we've got a whole bunch of them. We've got Jupiter and Mars retrograde, Mercury retrograde, Saturn retrograde. when you see a lot of retrogrades in ancient astrology, retrogrades very, very simply mean reversals, reversals of fate or fortune, sometimes delays as well, among other things. So we can say that with a good deal of confidence that there are going to be some reversals of fortune in this individual's life that are going to be very strong and sometimes very challenging related to the topic of children. With the moon co-present, it's enough to say that this person could be a single mother. They might have had problems or distance or isolation or even abandonment with their own parents or family. Sometimes that's a thing with Moon and Saturn in the 12th house. And we know that that in the past few years, the other thing that's been happening, that's been of major importance, is eclipses right over the nodes of the moon. So this is an eclipse cycle returning and activating those issues. The other thing that we've seen is the planet Saturn, one of the traditional 7 in Sagittarius from the very end of 2014 all the way up till, was it December of 2017? And Saturn would have gone through squares to the Sun, Mercury, Mars, Jupiter, the Moon, and Saturn. That is a very challenging Saturn transit because squares from Saturn to planets usually bring major crossroads in our life. They bring times where things are being isolated and separated through conflict. Isolating and separating is an action of Saturn. Conflict is an action of a square. So isolation and separation through conflict. When you apply that to, 6 of the traditional 7 planets in astrology, that's a major time period in life where there's going to be a lot of confrontation and conflict. And there's also going to be the potential for separating things out. So leaving behind a job, leaving behind, setting aside, leaving a marriage, becoming, strapped with the burden of being a mother, all these kinds of things. When you pair the Saturn transit along with the eclipses in the 5th house, along with the general signature of the South Node and the eclipses that she was born under, with the South Node in the 5th house and the ruler of the 5th place of children being in the 12th house and retrograde, that's when you get the picture of what's happened. So if this were my client and I was speaking to her several years ago, we would have talked about, isolation, separation, dividing or separating things, and hard decisions, a very strong, powerful crossroads moment, probably through different kinds of conflict. Now, granted that almost everything is in her 6th and 12th houses, and the 6th and 12th houses are also not easy houses. So this would have been a heavier talk to have a long time ago, but it obviously, the point of having a talk with someone like that if we had talked prior to her going through all of this, would have been to help guide her through, set her expectations at an appropriate level and give her some techniques or strategies for moving through that space. Just knowing like this is a karmic moment. It's a destined moment. There's nothing in a sense that you can do about it other than to live through it with dignity and as staying in a place of elevated consciousness as much as you can. And that has a lot to do with how we manage our bodies, our minds, our day-to-day life. So setting a person up for success has a lot to do with not so much a strategy for making the most out of everything or getting some result as much as it is about how to elevate our consciousness day by day so that we respond to these events in the highest, clearest state of consciousness possible. Anyway, more on that some other time. The other thing that, of course, is very conflicted in her chart is going to be the position of Venus. Venus in the 7th place is in her exile, conjoined with a lot of fortune, very powerfully fated events in love and relationships that are going to be conflicted. Venus wants love. She's being served up. Conflict. By who? Mars retrograde in the 12th house. That's not easy. So we can anticipate that there is at least going to be one story of real hardship in her life around relationships. Now, this does not mean that a person is doomed. Sometimes people will ask that question, does that mean I'm just doomed to repeat the same dynamic over and over again? Charts give us hints about this. For example, Venus in a cardinal sign tends to be more movable, more tropical. There's room there for people to take the wheel a little bit more. Tropical comes with the word tropos, which means to turn. This is an angular house too. Angular planets lend themselves to a more dynamic. They're more, consciously presenting themselves in the life of the individual. So conscious work and interaction with that planet can lead to change, especially when it's in a cardinal sign. The double-bodied Mars in the 12th house, or the mutable Mars in the 12th house, there's a little bit, some of the double-bodied signature has a little bit that's fixed and a little bit that's tropical, because it's a sign that embodies the two kinds of modalities on either side of it, cardinal and fixed. So all of the planets in the 12th house are a little changeable, but there's also some non-negotiables with them. So that just gives you a little bit of a general feeling for what kind of karma we're dealing with here. General thing that this person would want to be careful of would be relationships that tend toward, tend toward conflict, especially conflict that's verbal, mental, emotional, highly critical kinds of conflict, because this is Mars in a Mercury ruled sign. So cutting words, even sometimes violence, but cutting words, violence, maybe even someone who has some kind of self-destructive tendencies. You can see this also from Mars's dispositor Mercury being in its fall and retrograde under the beams of the sun in the 6th house. So sickness in relationships, whether it's mental, emotional, codependencies, or issues that are related to someone's verbal or mental intemperance. Those would be things to especially watch for in relationships. And some of that's going to relate back, you do some psychological work with a client over time, and you can talk about things like anxiety, self-esteem, stuff like that. And, again, as astrologers, we're only able to give advice so far as we're actually living a spiritual lives ourselves. We can't speak with authority outside of, what we hold ourselves to. So in any of my client sessions, I try to talk to people about the things that have worked for me. My own spiritual practices that I practice every single day, the kind of lifestyle that my spiritual teachers have helped me to establish as something that's kind of unwavering. I talk to almost every client about establishing those things, especially during tough times. So the question that client Jay had was, and now from a modern standpoint, actually, what other things have they been going through with outer planets? Well, Uranus has moved over Venus and the descendant very strongly, clobbered that just like a wrecking ball right over Venus, a lot of fortune and the descendant over the past few years. Neptune was on the sun and opposed to the moon the past few years. So, you look at the outer planets, they also give very clear pictures about the same kinds of things happening. So like I said, you've got eclipses in Saturn with one technique. Another technique, you're using Uranus and Neptune. They're both compatible. In the first year program, we use a lot of things that have to, timing techniques that involve the outer planets. But mostly what I want my students to be able to do is to read a chart using traditional methods, because it makes you clearer and more organized and more grounded. Then when you start building and adding in outer planets and modern techniques, it's just much easier. And the other benefit about this is that ancient astrology gives you very clear methods and practices for becoming a better predictive astrologer. It's very important that astrologers recognize, in my opinion, that astrology is both a psychological form of practice, we're helping people understand themselves and their behavior, but we're also predictive. Astrologers for thousands of years have believed in karma. They believe that the body that you take and the lifetime that you take is due to the nature of the soul, its disposition, its desires, and also its past actions. And some of the events that will play out in your life are due to past actions and due to the consequences of your desires and behaviors. So character is fate, and also past actions determine certain seasons of karma in this lifetime where we stand to learn or grow spiritually due to reaping the fruits of previous actions. And we have to be able to predict in an accurate manner, as well as describe things or talk about things psychologically. So this program is designed to give people a deeper, grounded understanding of fundamental predictive techniques from 2,500 years ago, as well as a lot of, we kind of take down the edifice of modern astrology, go back to the roots, and then we build our way back up. So that's part of the process. So client J wanted to know, hey, look, will I come through this? Is there anything on the radar for me that looks good? And someone, when we look at a chart like this, frankly, with so many planets in the 12th house and the 6th house, it can look a little dire, right? Like in ancient astrology, like these are very difficult places. The place of bad fortune, 6th house, the place of bad spirit, 12th house. My experience in working with people who have a lot of planets in the 6th and the 12th house, you have to follow the planetary dignities around and see what's up. Here we have something that's really interesting. Mercury and Jupiter are in each other's signs. They're both debilitated in each other's signs. That's called a mutual reception by debility. Mercury is in its fall and retrograde under the beams of the sun in the 6th place in Jupiter's sign, and Jupiter is in its exile in the 12th place, retrograde, and in Mercury's sign. So they're in each other's signs, both debilitated. What does that mean? Well, when you see someone who has a mutual debilitation between Jupiter and Mercury, you have someone who can use knowledge, right? Mercury-Jupiter combinations almost always have to do with knowledge and faith, wisdom and information, wisdom and rational skills, rational thinking abilities, as well as, some sense of mission in life or some sense of, optimism or hope or virtue. You often get those things combined. For example, someone who had, and then you see those two things working to solve problems and often in very innovative ways. For example, someone that had a mutual reception with debility between Mercury and Jupiter and Gemini, was Alexander Graham Bell. So Alexander Graham Bell had a family history of, there was a family history of deafness. There was, I can't remember if it was his brother or his mother or both, but his father was an inventor and a teacher of teachers of the deaf at, I think it was Boston University or something like that. Anyway, so Mercury in the old world was also a sign of inventors and teachers and wisdom and knowledge, and Jupiter also has a relation to those things, as well as to people who have more official or pronounced status of some kind, like a judge or an attorney or a senator or even like in the old world, like an emperor. Like they kind of have a mantle or a title of some kind. They're kind of a big person. So of course, Alexander Graham Bell becomes a professor like his father, and he becomes an inventor of teaching technology for the deaf, as well as eventually the telephone, which solves the problem of not being able to communicate with people over long distances. So his whole life, he works on trying to fix problems of bad communication or of debilitated communication, so to speak. Now, in that respect, the Mars-Jupiter mutual reception by debility is going to be very good when it comes to utilizing information and knowledge for the sake of fixing problems. And this is also reflected by the nature of the 6th and the 12th house, which provide so much difficulties and are places where you often see people who do humanitarian work or some kind of service-related work. They might be in the trenches a little bit, but look, and what was she? She was a naturopath, a naturopathic doctor, if I remember correctly. I have to go back and read what she wrote. Hold on, let me just pull it back up again. Gave up my license to practice naturopathic medicine. So what's my advice for a person like this is you're going to be at your best when you're doing something that combines that sort of the wisdom, a professional title, and to fix problems. When you're fixing problems, you'll be fixing your own problems. That's the feeling that I'm getting from this chart. Maybe it doesn't happen right away, but I don't think you're far off. You're in terms of the outer planets, they've done their damage. That we've got Neptune's moved off the sun, is going to be finishing up with the moon here shortly. Uranus has gotten off Venus. You're going to go through a little period of time where Pluto is going to go through a square to Venus. That's kind of a separate topic. Maybe more to do there with love and relationships in the next couple of years could still be an intense theme. But I do believe that, when as you pass over the getting out of the Neptune range of your sun and moon, which can be very disorienting. I think you're likely to pick back up where you left off with your work as a healer, so to speak, as a doctor, as a naturopath. And we look at your zodiacal releasing periods. This is another timing technique that ancient astrologers used. And one of the great things that we see here is that right now, February 10th, 2018, all the way to July 29th, 2020, you're in a 30-month long Aquarius period, which is ruled by Saturn. That takes us into the 5th house of children, and it takes us to the ruler Saturn in the 12th house. It's a difficult spot, mothering, probably doing some of it on your own, I'm sure. There's, Saturn in the 12th, not easy. It's a more austere period. But then look what happens. July 29th, 2020, we go into a 12-month-long Jupiter-ruled period. So if you think about summer of next year, not this year, but next year, then we're going into a Jupiter-ruled period in your 6th house. It's Pisces period, it's Jupiter-ruled. That generally will be nice because since 2015, November of 2015, you've been in back-to-back Saturn periods, which is the ruler of that 5th house of children. Saturn rules your 4th house of home and domestic life. You've been grinding it out with Saturn for a while. Remember back to the traditional technique that made the most sense was a huge passage of Saturn from late 2014 all the way to the end of 2017. This period is almost ending, and by July of next year, hit a 12-month-long Jupiter period. I think things are going to pick up significantly around that time, and you're also going to see, eventually you're going to see a Jupiter-Saturn conjunction in the 5th house of your chart, which is the house of children. Jupiter-Saturn conjunction in that house should provide sort of a fresh start, a new beginning around the topic of your children. I think that's going to be positive. I believe that's next year, 2020. But at any rate, those are just some general thoughts for you, Jay. Thank you for sharing your chart with us. I think, by July of 2020, you're going to be turning a corner and things will start looking up. And my advice would be to get back to doing things you love, especially applying wisdom to help fix problems. So that's client J. Let's go ahead and flip over to client D. So client D, I'm going to read you something about client D now. If I can find client D. So this is client D who says, hi, Adam, saw you were looking for a volunteer chart. The question would be, I recently met someone of the opposite sex with who I feel very connected on an emotional and also physical level. Being around them is very peaceful, and there is none of the crushing anxiety that I would feel in similar circumstances. Even if we don't know each other for a long time, I have experienced telepathy with them, and our communication goes between words or body language. Would there be something in my chart that would indicate meeting someone that feels truly fated? Have a lovely day. Well, thank you, client D. This is a good one. So first of all, it's congratulations on just, meeting someone. That's always exciting. Whether an astrologer can tell you exactly if a person that you meet is the one or not, it's not usually possible unless you're doing what's called a horary chart. This is at least not in my practice. You can have a pretty good look at the importance or kind of weight or gravity of a relationship first appearing based on transits. But in my experience, a horary chart, looking at a specific person that you've just met and kind of saying, do we have a future together? That's the kind of technique that I would typically use for this question. So what I'm going to do for you is just look at your chart and give you a general sense of what your chart says about relationships, what's going on right now in your chart, and what I think is likely to come, say, in the next couple of years around relationships. So, okay, so here's client D's chart. And let's start off by just talking a little bit about that soul-crushing anxiety. First of all, when we look for love and relationships, there's two general areas in ancient astrology that we look at. We look at the 7th place, which is a place that tells us about everything that we are joined with, merged with, or yoked with that is other than ourselves. It could be the gods or divinity. It could be sexuality, and it could be love and marriage. But it's anything other that we're joined to at a very deep level, even to the point where we lose ourselves or we immerse ourselves into something. This actually can be a very spiritual and religious house. It can also be a house that's related to sexuality in general. The seventh place in a chart, always a good place to look at. Venus is always a good place to look at because Venus represents love. Also, the moon for domestic life and marriage. These are good placements here. Okay, so first of all, a couple of things that we see. In this chart, we see that the seventh place is governed by Mars. So when you have Mars governing the seventh place, first of all, it can mean a variety of different things. Power struggles, a general aura of conflict or difficulty can surround relationships. That's just the god of war ruling the place of marriage and relationships. It can also mean that there's a powerful sex drive. Mars, as Mars related to sexuality or what we join with, is very passionate and intense. The other thing is that in general, there can be a desire to merge with things in a way that is very aggressive or assertive, like the ecstasy that an athlete gets when they get absorbed in the game, or the ecstasy that a hunter feels when they're on the hunt, or even the, so you think about passion, drive, desire. There's a desire for, meeting something in a very strong and direct, assertive way, and that's part of the picture of union in your chart. So when we see that, and then we see the Lord or ruler or host of the seventh place, Mars in the 12th. Okay. Relationships here may be a little self-destructive. The 12th place is a place where things are taken away from us, but also where we tend to veer or steer off course. 12th house is intimately related to the loss of control or to events that come in and somehow take us away from ourselves. We lose ourselves a little bit in the 12th house. So there could be a tendency to attract people who are very aggressive but a little destructive. They would probably be, for example, in a heterosexual dynamic here, a woman who's interested in men, this kind of Mars description, Mars in the sign of the maiden, the harvest maiden or the virgin in the 12th place. Men who are very mentally or intellectually sophisticated, intense, or critical, or skilled. That's Mars and Mercury's sign. Also youthful and a little bit unattached. That's the Virgo, the virgin. And also potentially a little destructive, right? Sometimes you think, for example, of you might think here of an angsty but sort of youthful poet or musician or something like that. One of the reasons for this is that, or even athlete or, a competitive personality, but someone who's really intelligent and maybe has some particular kind of skill. Virgo is often related to the hands, and Mercury ruled sign like this. You see Mercury's in Leo in the 11th place as the morning star. This person may be quite demonstrative. They may be a performer of some kind. That's why I said music. So when you see this kind of connection, you're thinking, I would say beware of guys that are, sort of angsty, smart, maybe have some kind of performing skill or intellectual, bravado or something like that, but maybe a little destructive. That would be a general warning. Or making choices that are a little impulsive. The other thing that you have to be careful of is Mars ruling your 7th place is in Mercury, and Mercury is a god of transactions, like the marketplace and exchanges of money. So Mars in Virgo has a very interesting relationship with sexuality and with relationships, because Mars in Virgo doesn't love to be attached to things, can be quite critical, and also sort of transactional. Transactional meaning there can be a feeling of either being used or taken advantage of that surrounds the relationship exchanges on some level. This may be complicated by the fact that, the dispositor of Mars, Mercury, looks pretty noble in the sign of the lion. And again, as a morning star, might have a pretty bright personality that appears in some ways really, grandiose or king-like or, virtuous or noble or regal. But underneath, this person may also have a more selfish agenda or a more transactional way of thinking and viewing people than they may let on. So those are all things that I would just sort of caution to be aware of in relationships. That's not to say that relationships can't happen. We have some other really lovely signatures in the chart around relationships. For example, Venus is at the top of the chart in the exaltation of Jupiter with a close square applying to Jupiter in Venus's sign. So this is a really nice connection between Venus and Jupiter in the chart. We would anticipate that a person with this kind of chart would probably be interested in art, performance, theater, something Venusian on some level. That they spend a lot of time doing Venusian things would suggest to me an artistic temperament, or something that is, where you have to be Venus in the sign of the moon. You have to be nurturing, cooking, tending something, even mothering something, or being a caretaker of some kind. But, Venus in Cancer is still Venus, thinking about art, beauty, harmony, friendship, sensuality, or sexuality, things like that. So Venus is very strongly on display in client D's life. This is their ascendant ruler. They're going to show up in the world like Venus in Cancer. They're probably going to have a lot of Venusian talents to maybe appear very beautiful or have a certain kind of charm. Also maybe a little shy or sensitive in the moon sign, and the moon kind of a little hidden under the light of the sun and in the 8th house here. There's also a mutual reception between the moon. The moon is in Venus's sign and Venus is in the moon's sign. So we see a nice connection between these two planets. Venus in the moon in the 8th house exalted in Taurus might mean marrying someone who is well-to-do or who has a family that's well-to-do. However, it wouldn't surprise me with the ruler of the 7th being in the turned 6th or in the 12th place if the individual wasn't at odds with or had some kind of challenge with their family, even if they do come from a wealthy or sort of more privileged background. But at any rate, the position of Venus and the moon in the 10th and the 8th with mutual reception would show a propensity or a tendency in the life to attract, stable, sort of loving Venus-moon dynamics, marriage, family, children, spouse, etc. Or at the very least, someone who has a more tranquil, romantic or artistic, side, and this would be probably favorable for at some point settling down into a pretty peaceful, romantic environment. I don't, not sometimes things don't last forever. Sometimes, I couldn't guarantee that this chart says happily ever after like any other chart. Most people in their life do not, find some perfect ideal happily ever after. So I'm always cautious about giving that impression. But I think that this chart, aside from the challenge with Mars, has some really nice things to offer for Venus and the moon together there. Now, what is coming for this individual right now? Well, a few things. One, we have eclipses right now in Venus's sign, and 10th house, 4th house eclipses in Cancer and Capricorn. We also have an impending Saturn return coming up in the early 2020s. So all of these things considered, there's a couple of things. First of all, it could be a time where work or domestic matters, like where you're living, what you're doing for a living, things that are happening with your family and family karma could be very pronounced, as could love or relationships. Eclipses around Venus oftentimes bring fated relationships. So is client D in a time where a fated relationship could appear? Yes, in general, I would say that's the case. However, this person has not yet gone through their Saturn return, and I have found consistently over and over and over again that there are one of two things that happen if someone meets someone of importance right as they're heading into a Saturn return. One, the individual will deepen or solidify a commitment during the Saturn return with the person that they've met, or two, the relationship will break off in a dramatic way that also becomes a sort of pivotal lesson for the rest of their life. So that's, I think client D in the early 2020s, if this relationship is to last, will likely, have a make or break moment during the Saturn return. Probably like 2022, if I remember correctly. I'm just doing this a little generally today. So um, that, so just, I would say, watch. If it gets more serious, just know that, there's going to be a deeper moment, a deeper confrontation of karma around this relationship that will come. Saturn is also currently in the fourth house in this individual's chart, beholding Venus from an opposition. That often means that there's a greater ache or a deeper longing for love and feeling alone, or feeling lonely and desiring of love. This can also create distortions in our perception of others when we meet them. I'm leaning a little bit more towards this person is probably nice, but under a Saturn-Venus opposition, I'm not convinced that this person will be the one. Again, that's just, in a sense, it's a little intuitive because it's based on seeing Saturn-Venus oppositions and what tends to come from them over 10 years of practice. But I don't want to be completely pessimistic here. I would not tell the client to stop dating the person. I would just say, just be cautious. You may feel as though you have sort of telepathic communication with the other person, but let me now use a modern technique. Now, if we bring in the outer planets, and I'm just going to bring in Neptune and Uranus here, you'll notice that the person right now has Saturn hovering right over Neptune and Uranus, while eclipses are pouring over Venus and while Saturn is generally beholding Venus from an opposition. This is the kind of thing that you would see from someone who may have a really romantic tendency, but also there's some pretty deep melancholy surrounding love and romance. We can see this in traditional terms because we have Venus-Moon mutual reception, with the moon in the difficult 8th place and the ruler of the 7th house in a very difficult place, the 12th. This is the same mood, you could say, as Venus opposite Neptune and Uranus. It has the mood of being someone who wants or values traditional love, who might be a romantic or an artist or have an artistic temperament, but there is an edge in relationships, a spirit of criticism or divisiveness, or someone who is not fully obtainable, or where there's a transactional nature. I would be very careful of attraction to people that feel sort of larger than life, that have one appearance but are a different way sort of behind the scenes. I mentioned that earlier in connection to the dispositor of Mars being Mercury in Leo. Looks really nice, looks really flashy as the morning star, but there's still this troubling relationship with Mars in the 12th. So I'm kind of skating around here, but in modern terms, the fact that Saturn is currently hovering right over Neptune and Uranus would suggest to me that this person is, this individual client D is may be having real feelings for this person, but may also be tapping into some of the melancholy and longing and dreaminess that may be a part of a pattern in life of not fully seeing those that she's attracted to as clearly as possible, and potentially making some self-destructive decisions as a result, or of being alone over a period of time and feeling that heaviness and of wanting to share something romantic and special, but not always seeing things clearly. So I would be very careful of that, especially given another modern technique that in the years to come, not too long, like let's say the next 3 to 5 years, Neptune is going to go through the 6th house and oppose the ruler of your 12th. And that's often a time, or the ruler of your 7th in the 12th. That's the marriage house ruler. And Neptune opposes the marriage house ruler over the next 3 to 5 years. There's going to be a theme of deeper learning around exactly what I'm talking about illusions and love. So I would use extra caution right now around getting in a relationship, because I think this chart, even though I don't know for sure, I'm an educated guesser like all astrologers, I think this chart would say right now that it's more likely that you're not seeing things entirely clearly, even if there's some magical elements of your connection, even if it's a good connection. So I would at the very least caution you to be very conservative and cautious about committing or getting overly, eager or impulsive about this relationship. Do I feel like a relationship is possible down the road? Yeah, I do. I think that there's some nice transits down the road. For example, one of the transits that I would really like for you would be 2 years in a row where Jupiter is going to go through your 6th house. So for example, this is, let's see, November 2019, like 2022 and 2023, right around there, if I have that figured out in my head really quickly. Jupiter will go through your 6th, then trine Venus, and then go into your 7th. I think I like those transits a little bit more than I would like a Saturn transit involved with Venus at the outset of something, but that's just me. So in other words, I think there will be choices, opportunities down the road at the tail end of your Saturn return. I like that better. Even at that time, Saturn will be moving into Pisces and will start trining Venus. I think that's better for you than the hard opposition to start something under. At any rate, those are my opinions, Client D. I thank you so much for listening. I hope this was useful for you and for everyone else. I have one more client's chart that I'm going to look at. This one even more briefly. Let's see. So this is Client K, who just said, show me what you've got. Show me what you see. So I'm going to keep this one really simple because we're almost out of time. This individual is in the midst of a Saturn return. Saturn return in the 7th place. And I've just been talking about this already a little bit, Saturn returns and love and relationships. Let's talk a little bit about what it means to go through a Saturn return. So first of all, Saturn return happens, around 29 and a half years or so. It's the return of the planet Saturn to the place where it was in the sky when you were born. It takes place as long as the planet, as Saturn, is in the same sign that it was in when you were born. So it's a long thing. It's not just a degree-based transit. It happens as soon, in this case, as Saturn enters Capricorn, lasts as long as Saturn is in Capricorn. Now, as Saturn is going through that 7th place, this is a good Saturn in her chart, aside from the fact that it's a nighttime Saturn, which can provide some difficulties. It's in an angular place, which means it's strong, and it's in its own sign or dignity, and that's a good thing. It also is being bona fide by an exalted Jupiter in Cancer. So what does that mean? Well, this Saturn return, when it comes around, is going to be about the threshold between your, let's say, your youthful years and your adult years. So your adult years from, say, 30 to 60 you're walking into those adult years during a Saturn return, and there are often what I would call threshold lessons, rites of passage, initiation experiences into adulthood. For this individual, it's going to have a lot to do with 7th house matters. What is that? Well, the 7th house was related to this word dousis in Greek, which means to immerse yourself into something, like diving into the ocean. For example, when planets set in the west, they vanish, they dive below the horizon and disappear. So anything that you immerse yourself into, or anything that you dive into, as in sex, as in joining with the other in marriage, or even, again, in worship of the gods, anything that you're deeply immersed in. So this person will tend at times to be immersed in Saturnine things, even though they themselves are showing up as very lunar, moon ruled ascendant, and very Jupiterian. The moon is in Sagittarius in the 6th house. So I'd anticipate that this person be a combination of sweet and rowdy, or maybe a little bit of a partier, with moon in Sagittarius in the 6th house, which was called the joy of Mars traditionally. This person may get themselves into a little bit of trouble in life by being a little bit reckless, or by sicknesses as a result of doing things that are excessive. May struggle at times with eating or eating-related problems or issues, self-image with the ruler Jupiter exalted back in the 1st place. May at times care too much about how they appear. Again, could be a little bit on the reckless side of things. And also, but at the same time, maybe very sweet, very caring. And also, you could say that this person may have a desire of some kind to do mothering things or nurturing things. That's also a possibility. So those are just a few general observations, but there are many other things that could be said about this combination. The reason I'm pointing this out, however, is because you see all this sweetness with just a a tinge of like a little bit of rowdiness. And that's a sixth house read that's more traditional. And I take a longer time to get into the sixth house and explain why I'm going there, but I can't right now. So the exchange, they're in mutual reception with one another as well. So this is another person who might be good at pouring a lot of their emotion or passion into things, but things that are going to be a little conflicted, or like, for example, someone who might be good in the military, or someone who could be a good athlete, or someone who could work in a fast-paced restaurant or industry like that's, fast-paced or competitive in some way, but they have to pour a lot of their emotion and their care into it. A hospital, an ER, or something, a labor delivery room. Those are different things that could also make sense for this individual. But what they're going to tend to immerse themselves in, sometimes lose themselves in, is going to be Saturn in Capricorn. That would be potentially a partner, spouse, marriage, for example, that's more traditional. And that possibly is not only is a little bit more traditional, but might also be a little bit stifling or confining. Why? Because this is a nighttime Saturn, and nighttime Saturn is going to tend more towards the darker side of Saturn. So you're thinking about a strong traditional earner, someone who has money and respect, someone who has pride, status, and maybe even beauty, but may tend to be a little corrupt morally, or they may tend to be a little controlling or rigid or intense or severe. So I would say be very careful about marrying a dark Saturn person, a strong, appealing, but potentially a little bit dark Saturn. Be careful of wanting something that's about status or success or whatever. On the outside, it looks good. Saturn in ancient astrology, for example, was associated with feigned appearances, something that looks good, but that, maybe more, a little bit more of the dark Saturn underneath. Looks good meaning looks traditional, looks stable, looks reliable, looks respectable, looks achieved. But again, underneath the surface may not be, end up being a little confining. So that being said, during the Saturn return period, there can be very deep and intense lessons around relationships of the nature that I'm talking about right now. On the other hand, a few other things that can come up. The seventh place is a place where planets set. Saturn in the seventh is a place of endings. So when Saturn transits through the seventh house, you think about very important life-defining endings, whether it's a breakup, a grandparent passing, finishing school, leaving a job, saying no to something. Saturn is often about separations and endings anyway, as is the seventh house. So you're thinking about, things that have come to a conclusion, right? Things that are ending, things that are passing away or dying, completion, resolution, being done with something, making hard boundaries and setting up firm boundaries in your life. So clear resolutions. Also, sometimes the deepening of commitment. Saturn does, at its best, sort of represent seriousness and commitment. And so defining commitments, those are also things that are really important for this individual right now, vis-a-vis the Saturn return. I would also wonder if there is not some call to grow up in some way. Saturn in the seventh pressing against Jupiter and given the Jupiter contact with the moon in the first and sixth. The moon in the first and sixth in this position can be a little childish. We also see, for example, Venus in Mars's sign in the fifth house. That's another sign of someone who can be a little, they can be good at having fun. They can, there might be a healthy Venusian side, but it can also be a little, it can veer off a little bit more towards the destructive elements. Moon and Sag in the sixth as ruler of the first can be exactly like that as well. So the Saturn opposition to Jupiter that's happening all year long, as well as Saturn eventually conjoining the descendant, can bring not only endings and defining, finishing, or resolving moments, defining moments in relationships, but it can also force the person to become more mature. Saturn's demand, Saturn as a house guest in our lives, when Saturn comes through, Saturn's often saying, I want more seriousness from you. The seventh house is also a place where we meet the other. And what does the other need from us? That's shown to us by whatever planet is currently transiting through the seventh. Saturn in the seventh needs more commitment, more adult-like qualities, more, So sometimes Saturn through the 7th is about hard growing up experiences. When Saturn transited through my 7th, for example, I got married, but my parents got divorced. During Saturn in my 7th place, there was a lot of really difficult kind of growing up moments. And this was, I guess for me, it was 2013 to 2014, 20, it was Saturn in Scorpio. So it was a ways ago. But that passage for me also culminated in a number of very important endings in my life, which I won't go into. There were several deaths in my family. There was a divorce of my parents. There were some personal endings for me that were very big. And then there was also taking this big step forward and becoming committed in marriage. So it can be very positive. I'm not trying to make it overly dark. But my sense is at a first Saturn return, this is a coming of age moment. This is a moment that's demanding a little bit more seriousness, a little bit more maturity, setting aside anything that's too frivolous or partying too much or getting involved with the wrong kinds of things. Be careful of the status or trophy boyfriend that's a little bit darker. Be careful of getting married just to get married. At the same time, could be some really nice accomplishments or achievements or milestones that mark a transition into a more focused period where you're defining your commitments more. So those are the kinds of things I'm saying. I'm going like mile a minute because I wanted to try to get this all in, and I really spent too much time on the first chart compared to the second two. So anyway, that's what I've got for you guys. Listen, the course starts on June 9th. Sundays. It meets for a year. There's 30 lessons in the program. The first 20 lessons are all history of astrology, the philosophy, spiritually, and sort of metaphysically. And then all of the techniques that ancient astrologers use, which are very different from the techniques of modern astrology. They help you to become more specific, more predictive, more concise, more organized, more clear in how you read. And then gradually, if you stick around for my year 2 and year 3 programs, which I also teach, a lot of my students do, then we start building back into how to intelligently use lots of modern techniques and build them back into your practice. So that's what I teach. I teach Hellenistic astrology. First 20 lessons are all that you need to know to start utilizing some of the most amazing tools in ancient astrology. And then the last 10 lessons of the course are all live readings where I have an actual person in with me. I'm not just demoing a chart, and I'm doing a reading for them in a much slower, more methodical manner over 60 or 90 minutes. And we're having an interaction, and you're getting to see how I actually do client practice with these methods. And then you can use those experiences to build your own. After the client leaves the class, we sit around and talk about the reading as a group. And it's just an incredible experience. I've built some of my greatest friendships with students in classes over the years, and we all become a pretty tight-knit group by the end. They're live, everyone's on camera, you can ask questions, we interact the whole time. It's a great time. The last 10 lessons, like I said, are object lessons. We're actually working with live clients. And then, like I said, I have a year 2 and year 3 program as well. So I hope to see some of you there. If you want to, check it out on my website, nightlightastrology.com, and check out the certification course tab. This is Ancient Astrology for Modern Times. Begins on June 9th. The early bird rate is $12.99, and that is done on the 31st of this month. So you have 10 more days to take advantage of that. Otherwise, there is a full tuition option with a 12-month payment plan. And for those who can't afford the tuition, if you're a full-time parent, you're only part-time employed, you're a full-time student, something like that, you're retired, disability, whatever the case might be, if you're experiencing some kind of financial hardship, you can always email me at nightlightastrology@gmail.com and apply for need-based tuition, which is a sliding scale that usually is flexible enough for people who are on a really tight budget. So I try to make that available for people as well. I've led hundreds and hundreds of people through this course over the years. I've been doing it for 10 years. If you want to talk to any of my former students, ask them about it, you can. I've also posted a few interviews with some of my former and current students, so you can listen to them. If you have any questions for me about the course, feel free to email me as well. I hope this gave you a look at who I am and what I do, and I hope to see some of you in class soon. And thank you to all of our clients, Client K, Client J, and Client D, for sharing yourselves, for being vulnerable and opening yourselves up. Our prayer, all of us who are listening, also I hope you'll join along with me in saying that our prayer for you is that you would meet the your destiny path with grace and humility and courage. That you would that your heart would be opened up more and more every day. That you would find your true happiness in every path that you walk. So that being said, thank you to everyone for listening, and I hope to see some of you in class soon. Take care.